Right. Thank you very much, Claire, for this very nice introduction. I hope you can all hear me. And delighted to welcome you all, both people in the room here and joining us virtually. My name is Stéphane Goldstein. For the past 6 or 7 years or so, I've been working for myself as an independent research consultant with a particular interest in information literacy, media literacy, digital literacy. Over the course of this time, I've been quite heavily involved with CILIP's Information Literacy Group, and more recently, over the past year or so, I've been helping to coordinate an initiative called the Media and Information Literacy Alliance, or MILA for short, of which I'll be saying quite a bit over the next 20 minutes or so. So this talk is actually intended to bring you up to date with current developments and prospects in the area of media and information literacy, with a specific focus on the UK. So apologies to anyone who's joining from outside the UK, but this is very much about developments over the past 2-3 years or so in this country. So it's media and information literacy, the road ahead, which obviously suggests that things are happening, and they are indeed. I think the starting point, perhaps, if we're talking about this, is to actually define what media and information literacy is, and indeed why it's important, why it's relevant, and why it's actually quite topical and pertinent in the current context. So we'll start with a definition, and this is one of lots of possible definitions. I mean, I wouldn't like to pretend in any way that there is a unique definition which fits all possible circumstances. This is a definition which has been devised quite recently by MILA. It's still provisional. There are still 1 or 2 little tweaks, but it gives you an idea of what it is that we're talking about. Now, media and information literacy is a hybrid concept. It brings together 2 things, information literacy and media literacy. Now, for those of you who've been working in the realm of librarianship, information literacy might be a familiar concept, because as a concept, it's something which is quite closely tied with librarianship. It's at its origins, it was very closely associated with academic skills, with research skills, with particular skills associated, for instance, with referencing and finding a way around bibliographies. More recently, it's expanded to cover realms which lie beyond the world of research and higher education. And CILIP's 2018 definition of information literacy encapsulate a much broader approach to information literacy, which is very context specific. In other words, it puts information literacy, it places information literacy in lots of different contexts, not just education, but the workplace, health, everyday life, citizenship, democracy, etc. Media literacy has slightly different origins. It has its origins from the world of media studies, and in the past it was very much associated with developing an understanding of journalism and the conventional media environment. With the development of social media in particular, media literacy has also, in a sense, expanded its scope to the extent that nowadays, I would argue that information and media literacy are really very largely overlapping concepts. They're not identical by any means, but it's like a Venn diagram. I mean, the area of overlap is actually quite significant, and which is why it's actually possible to develop, in a sense, this hybrid notion. Now, the idea of media and information literacy together was originally set out by UNESCO about 12-13 years ago. UNESCO, of course, is the UN agency, which is particular focus on culture and education. I think it realized, actually, quite rightly, in my view, that there was some sense in actually bringing these 2 concepts together. So anyway, there you have a definition. I hope it makes sense. Now, I said at the outset that this is about explaining why it is that this is relevant and why it's important and why it matters. I mean, I would argue that it's always mattered, and in a sense, information literacy has been inherent in librarianship ever since perhaps the very early days of libraries 2 millennia ago. So it's always been there. What's changed? Well, particularly in this country, in the UK, over the past 3-4 years or so, is that there's been some shift in the policy environment. About 4 or 5 years ago, when government and public agencies talked about this sort of area, it was tended to be framed in a rather narrow, specific way around functional digital skills. So it was very much about getting people up to speed with the basics of the internet, and not just people, but also businesses. There has been a more recent impetus for broadening this beyond a narrowly defined view of digital literacy to relate to rather more, I would say, societal concepts. And much of that actually has been driven by a greater awareness of the dangers represented by things like misinformation and disinformation and fake news. So there's been in the UK, a rather belated reaction. Some countries, I would say, are well ahead of the curve, including in the US and several other countries in Europe. So I think the UK, and more specifically even England, has come to appreciate the importance of these issues rather more recently. There have been some milestones in recent years which have sort of marked the development of public thinking. The Cairncross Review on Journalistic Standards was a review commissioned in 2019 by the government to look at the ethics and integrity of journalism in the context of rapidly changing social media landscapes. And that report actually had quite a bit to say about media literacy and how media literacy could help to reinforce, in a sense, the professional standards of journalism. Same year, 2019, saw the publication of government's white paper on online harms. I have to keep reminding myself of what online harms means in government parlance. I mean, their definition includes things like child sexual exploitation and abuse, terrorist content, anonymous abuse, the abuse of public personalities, public figures, cyberbullying, and crucially, misinformation and disinformation. So that white paper proved to be quite influential in terms of the next big thing. And that big thing was just over a year ago, the publication of the online media literacy strategy. I should say that this only applies to England. Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland are in a separate situation. Sorry, it's England and Wales, I beg your pardon. It's Scotland and Northern Ireland which are dealt with differently. So for the first time, there is a sort of a holistic framework for developing a strategic approach to media literacy. And when I say strategic, it's cross-governmental. The government department that's charged with this is DCMS, which is the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sports. And the point about this strategy is that it actually recognizes the societal importance of boosting and promoting and developing media literacy skills and competencies and awareness. It's quite important to mention in passing that the strategy very explicitly recognizes a role for librarians, and more specifically, I should say, public librarians. And the government has even put a little bit of money into this, actually, and I'll say a bit more about it later. The strategy talks about media literacy. I mean, in a sense, and bearing in mind what I said earlier about the fact that these definitions overlap to some extent, it doesn't really matter what you call it. The government has chosen to focus this on media literacy. In fact, the report, the strategy says quite a lot. There's a whole chapter on information literacy. And if you read it, I think you'll see that in reality, when they talk about media literacy, they're really talking about both media and information literacy. So let's not get too hung up on definitions and what things are called. It's actually, you know, it may as well be a strategy on media and information literacy. It's founded on 6 principles, this strategy. I won't go through all 6 of them, but there are 2 of them which I think are particularly relevant. Principle 2 says that users should understand how the online environment operates and uses this to inform decisions online. And principle 3, which I would argue is the more important one, the most important one, or most relevant one, says that users should understand how online content is generated and be able to critically analyze the content they consume. Now, the reason I think this is important, because this actually introduces within the strategy the notion of critical thinking. It's really quite an important step for the government to have actually recognized this. So it's an important document. It sets the scene. It's far from perfect. It has, in my view, 2 major shortcomings. The first is that it's founded very largely on, I mean, it draws from the Online Harms White Paper. So it's very largely founded on the notion of countering risks and dangers. So it's, in a sense, it's quite defensive. It's about, you know, perceiving a risk, and there is a real risk there. I mean, I've highlighted some of the online harms earlier, and it's because it's defensive, it doesn't really say enough, in my view, about how media literacy and information literacy are actually quite important as fundamental concepts in their own right, to in a sense enhance people's ability to take part in democratic discourse, to be engaged with society, and in other words, it doesn't go sufficiently far beyond talking about countermeasures. The other main weakness is that, unfortunately, it says really very little about how media and information literacy, how media literacy contributes or is addressed as part of the education process, particularly the school education process. I think there are many of us involved in this area who believe that the school curriculum is really very weak in this area, that it approaches media literacy and information literacy in a very ad hoc way. Now, the strategy actually has a short section on education, on school education, but the section reads like a Department for Education press release. And, you know, essentially it says, well, everything's all right. We're dealing with this. This is a box that we've ticked. Let's move on to the next thing. And in actual fact, that's simply not true. So I think there's still quite a lot of work to be done in terms of getting better recognition of how media literacy and information literacy fits in an education system which is actually fit for purpose in the 21st century. As well as 6 principles, the strategy also includes 6 challenges. I won't go through them. I hope that they're self-explanatory. But the point about those challenges is they actually lay the basis for how the strategy is intended to be implemented in future years. So one of the aspects of the strategy is that it commits the government to set out annual action plans for at least the next 3 years. And those action plans are actually founded on taking forward and implementing those 6 challenges. And I'll say something about it in a minute, because it's actually already started. I mean, the first action year has actually got off the ground. I would maybe just say a few words about the last of those challenges, which is actually where MILA fits in. And one of the things that the DCMS found out in the course of the research that accompanied the development of the strategy was that they identified something like 170 different initiatives across the country, which were more or less related to media literacy. But that's 170 initiatives from 170 different players who are all doing their own little thing in their own little corner in a sort of silo sort of way. And there isn't really an overarching level of coordination, and the strategy recognizes that this is a weakness and that steps need to be taken to ensure more effective coordination, so that those different initiatives, and indeed any new initiatives that emerge in future, take place in a more sort of cohesive environment. So, taking forward the strategy, I mentioned earlier that we have the first of series of annual action plans. The first one covers the financial year 2022-2023, so we're right in the middle of it. The government DCMS set up a task force to foster greater collaboration across media literacy sectors. The task force has a steering board. Nick Paul, in his capacity of Chief Executive of CILIP, actually sits on this steering board. So the library world is represented at a fairly high level. Importantly, the task force has been given funding, £500,000, which is not completely insignificant, to take forward projects. And the focus of its activity over the next 2-3 years is going to be on what's referred to as hard-to-reach citizens. The focus there is going to be quite heavily focused on looking at regional disparities. Government DCMS issued a call in the summer in July. The deadline for responses to the call was right at the end of August. I won't comment about the wisdom of issuing a call right in the middle of the summer holiday period, but that's another matter. So we don't yet know at this stage what projects are going to be funded. They're in the course of being evaluated at the moment. We suspect, I mean, that the guidance that was given out at the time of the call was issued suggests that there will be quite some emphasis at looking at very practical developments and resources at the regional level, either within a single region or across different regions for comparative purposes. This is where it gets a little bit confusing, I'm afraid, because in addition to the task force fund, there is also a separate program fund, which is also run by DCMS, but it's actually different. And when I asked some DCMS civil servants why it is that they're running two funding streams simultaneously under two slightly different headings, I'm afraid I didn't get a convincing answer. It actually makes me wonder whether they actually know themselves. But that particular fund actually has a slightly smaller budget of £400,000 over 2 years, and that will address 3 of the 6 challenges that I mentioned earlier. Vulnerable users, which is about providing support to vulnerable users who are currently underserved by media literacy initiatives. Evaluation, which is about developing new approaches to effectively evaluate the current and future media literacy interventions. There is a view out there that a lot of the evaluation that takes place at the moment is really very short term. It's very much about looking at whether a particular course or a particular toolkit generates immediate results. The evaluative methodologies which exist at the moment tend not to look at longer term impact, and so that particular strand of the call wants to look at perhaps some more robust and more effective ways of evaluating media literacy interventions. And the final strand of this particular call is under the heading of misinformation and disinformation, which is about finding ways of developing people's resilience to misinformation, disinformation, and fake news. There's another small strand as well I should mention in passing, which is about upskilling librarians, and a small amount of money has been provided to Libraries Connected. Libraries Connected is the body that represents public libraries. To develop a training module for public librarians in media and information literacy. The training module was unveiled not very long ago, a few weeks ago. I can't really say very much more about it. I think it's still too early days to say whether it's actually being effective, but I think it's a question of watching that space and look out for information on the Libraries Connected website. Sorry, I should have said at the outset that all the documents which I'm referring to throughout this presentation are referenced right at the end, and the presentation will be made available to everybody. So you'll be able to follow the links to the different things that I've been talking about. The other important thing is this piece of legislation which was introduced in Parliament. Oh goodness, I think it was either late last year or early this year. It's been going through Parliament. It's gone through a lot of the House of Commons committee stages. It's about to go to the House of Lords. The bulk of this bill is actually about regulating social media platforms. I won't say anything about that because it's less relevant to what we're talking about. I mean, it's actually raised quite a lot of concern among people interested in civil liberties because there are aspects of it which are deemed to be a little bit authoritarian, but we'll park that for the time being. But it's a major piece of legislation. It was delayed. It's probably expected to be enacted finally after it goes through all its stages in Parliament and receive royal assent. I would say it's unlikely to be before spring of next year. Now, in its original version, when it was originally published, it had a very short section, but a crucial section on media literacy. It was only a couple of pages, but it included two things. First of all, it included a definition of media literacy, and it would, that's particularly important because in a piece of legislation, having a definition in a piece of legislation, of course, gives it a statutory weight. I mean, this would have been a very official, statutorily recognized definition of media literacy. It also outlined, this particular section outlined Ofcom's duties. Now, Ofcom is the media regulator, and it outlined Ofcom's duties with regards to promoting and supporting media literacy. For reasons which are partly baffling, the government decided during the various committee stages to actually remove all the provisions relating to media literacy. And this has caused quite a lot of disquiet, and I'm certainly concerned about it. So, organizations like Full Fact, I mean, Full Fact is perhaps the major fact-checking organization in the UK, have expressed serious concern about this. I mean, they've called for the strengthening of Ofcom's media literacy role through, for instance, promotion of media literacy, with regards to regulating user-to-user services, social media platforms, in other words. Full Fact has also called for the publication of a strategy for delivering the new media literacy duty. It's hoping, I mean, organizations like Full Fact are hoping that it'll be able to get amendments to the legislation, particularly through the House of Lords. It remains to be seen whether that will be successful or not. But at the moment, in the bill in its current draft form, unfortunately says very little about media literacy. It strikes me as being a bit of a missed opportunity, but I think we'll see how things pan out. I mentioned Ofcom. I'll say something very briefly because as the media regulator, the UK's media regulator, they themselves have a statutory responsibility for undertaking media literacy research. And they've been doing this for quite a number of years, for at least 15 years, I'd say. And if you look at their website, linked to later, you'll see that there is a very, very impressive annual program of research which looks at people's online behavior, both adults and young people. Some of the research they do, I mean, most of it is actually quantitative, a lot of it is qualitative, and it includes ongoing research which has been actually sort of deepened over quite a long period of time. They are looking, I mean, irrespective of what happens with the legislation I was mentioning, Ofcom are developing their own role, and they're doing so under those 6 headings. So they're developing a sort of a model which is going to help them to develop their offering. Of those 5 pillars, the evaluate pillar, I would say, is the one which has actually gone furthest in terms of its development. And what will happen there is that next month, probably well, in October, maybe November, they intend to publish a toolkit, an evaluation toolkit, which is intended to provide guidance on how to design and conduct and use evaluation for all media literacy initiatives. So it'll be a toolkit which will be available to anyone, any organization that is interested in developing evaluation. Now, this is important in light of what I was saying earlier about one of the challenges in the strategy. And what this toolkit will also do is to provide a library, a media literacy evidence base, effectively, which will be searchable, which will also give practitioners insights into what works and what doesn't with regards to existing media literacy initiatives. So that's something that will, fingers crossed, happen relatively soon in the next few weeks. So I mentioned a little bit earlier that absence of coordination was one of the features, one of the challenges outlined in the strategy. And this is actually a direct quote from the strategy. This is what it says under this heading. I mean, I completely agree with this. I mean, there is a degree of bittiness, shall we say, about the way that this whole area has been approached in the past. And this is actually where MILA fits in. So MILA, the Media and Information Literacy Alliance, which was launched in October last year, so it's almost a year old. And its purpose is actually, to a large extent, to address that particular challenge. Now, a lot of us working in the area of information literacy have actually been wanting an initiative like this for a long time, and certainly from my perspective, I've been for years talking to a whole range of players in the public sector, in the not-for-profit sector, in the commercial sector, trying to develop an interest in media and information literacy beyond the library world. It has to be said, to a large extent, those conversations have fallen on deaf ears. The existence of the strategy, the existence of the initiatives that I've been talking about has added in more recently a bit of impetus, and I would say a bit of credibility to the very notion of media and information literacy. So I think that nowadays, when we approach people with a view to seeking a more coordinated approach, and simply with a view of generating more interest in media and information literacy, we can do so with a bit more confidence, knowing that what we're doing corresponds to official public policy. So that really provided the rationale for MILA in the way that it was set up not very long ago. It's very much, I should stress, a collaborative approach. It's still a very young organization. It's a cross-sector, it's a coalition, and that's its mission. It's started going down this road. It's still very, very early in its development. I'll talk a little bit later about the challenges that it's facing and the things that it's achieved so far, but that's what essentially it's all about. I mean, advocacy is an obvious thing. We need to promote media and information literacy, to develop greater awareness of it across the country. It's about capacity building, getting organizations to work together jointly. Again, this is very much about addressing the challenge in the strategy. It's about fostering research, and if possible, funding research, or leveraging funding for research, relevant research. Program delivery would follow from research to a large extent, and it's also a platform for collaboration and networking, exchanging of views. It's got, at the moment, we've got about 200 or so individuals and organizations on our mailing list. Roughly half of them are in the library and information sciences sector. The other half represent a whole range of sectors in the not-for-profit sector, in education, school and higher education, academia, and a range of other organizations. This is what's been done so far. As I said, it was launched just under a year ago. we've published a draft media and information literacy framework. I'll say a bit more about it in the next slide. We have just commissioned, we've raised a little bit of money, not very much, to undertake a comprehensive review of information literacy research. This is going to get off the ground very, very soon, and it'll be completed by around March or April next year. This will be important because it'll provide a rather lacking evidence base on why it is that information literacy is actually important. When we go out and argue to try to underscore the rationale for media information literacy, it's important to actually have the evidence at hand to demonstrate why this is important. And it has to be said that a lot of the evidence has been missing to date. So this will help to plug a gap. We worked with colleagues at Edinburgh Napier University who have published a study very recently. It's available on the MILA website on the impact of information literacy. And that particular piece of work, the report, which has stemmed from that, will serve as a basis for developing an information literacy impact framework. So that might actually be closely aligned with what Ofcom are currently hoping to do with their own media literacy toolkit. A lot of what's been done over the past few months has been about, effectively laying the basis for MILA as an organization. I mean, it's not a legal entity. I mean, it operates as an unincorporated body. It's not a company, it's not a charity, but nevertheless, we've had to develop terms of reference. We've set out a charter, and all that takes. It's a bit boring in many ways, but it's work that needs to be done. I've mentioned the 200 or so organizations and individuals on our mailing list. We've just started publishing regular quarterly newsletters, and we've got quite a nice looking website now. Well, at least I hope you'll think it's nice. This is our board. And I've just put this up there just to underline the extent to which we are looking to seek representation from a diverse range of bodies. I mean, obviously the board is only a relatively small subset of the overall mailing list. It's not a membership organization, by the way. The board's decided early on that at this particular point in time, particularly, it would simply be too onerous to actually run this as a fully fledged membership organization. I mean, that might happen in future, but we decided that it would not be appropriate for now, at any rate, to start recruiting people and to ask people to start paying membership dues. We're talking essentially about stakeholders. There is a charter which I mentioned, and if you sign the charter, you sign a document which effectively commits you to agreeing to the sort of terms on which MILA operates, and the charter actually underscores a commitment to the sort of principles underlying media and information literacy. So there you have it, and you'll see it's certainly not just restricted to the library world. Excuse me, I mentioned the MILA framework a little bit earlier. This is also available on our website. Excuse me a second. It's water, it's not anything else. It's not vodka, I can assure you. The idea of the framework is to make media and information literacy relevant. Now, last year, MILA conducted a series of interviews to try to tease out how media and information literacy could, in a sense, be related to people's everyday experiences. And as a result of these interviews, what we concluded provisionally, because this is still draft, is that it could be helpful to actually relate media and information literacy to a set of lifelong aspirations, and 5 of those aspirations were identified, and they're there. Be healthy, be socially conscious, be connected, be informed, and be empowered. Now, what you see there on screen is really just a very, very simple summary of what these aspirations are. If you go on the website, you'll see rather more detail about outlining examples of those aspirations and how and why it is that media and information literacy helps with them. Now, the point of this is that we want to ensure that MIL as a concept is not something abstract. It's not seen as something which is purely academic. It's seen as something which is very, very relevant to people's lives in lots of different contexts. So this is still work in progress, and we still very much welcome comments about this. I mean, you're quite free to look on the website, and you'll see the framework there. And we're hoping that perhaps towards the end of this year we'll have finalized this. So there's still plenty of time to actually indicate your views. Those are the challenges ahead. I mean, as I said, MILA is a young organization. We're actually organizing an away day for the board next week, next Monday, which will be an opportunity for us to look in detail about how we would like to develop strategically and start defining a substantive program of activities, but also looking at what we want to be as an organization in a year or two. How we see our role as an influencer, how we can engage with a variety of stakeholders, and particularly stakeholders that have the ear of government. How we can develop and maintain momentum and not just turn into a simple talking shop, because that's always a risk with initiatives such as this. How we can raise funds, and that's a huge problem, as you can imagine. I mean, you know, I mentioned earlier that the government is making some funding available through the calls that it issued over the summer, but that's not necessarily sufficient to sustain an initiative like MILA on an ongoing basis. Here too, we would greatly welcome, on the basis of your respective experiences, any suggestions, any ideas. I'm not asking anyone to contribute any money. I think that would be unreasonable, but any thoughts on the basis of what you've done in your own realms of activity about how we might develop and how we might ensure that 1 or 2 years down the line, MILA remains a relevant and indeed, hopefully, influential organization. And there we are. Those are the references to the various documents which I've been talking about. And that's me. And I think that's it. And I do apologize if I've talked a bit too long. I think I've spoken for 5 minutes longer than I would have liked, but I'm more than happy to take any questions or criticisms or anything.